Hey everybody. So that, if you didn't know, was one of my son's personal favorites, Johnny Cash Ring of Fire. And some of you may be sitting in period 7 right now because you had been already in period 2 and you're like, wait a minute, am I in the eternal hellfires because I have to sit and do another one of these highlighted readings? No, you're not. And I apologize if it feels that way. But it's really the easiest way for me to do this because, in all honesty, the French Revolution, everybody, is friggin' complicated. And this now makes me doubly feel bad because I feel like that professor that writes a book and then makes his students use that textbook and buy it because the French Revolution is so complicated. Really, the only way for me to easily break it down for you would to be to use a paper I wrote when I was getting my master's degree on a class I was taking about the French Revolution. And so, behold, I officially am holding hypocrisy in my hands because that is what we're doing right now. We're doing a paper I wrote, I'm making you read. And you know what? I don't know what else to say other than Mountain Dew will hopefully help me choke down that hypocrisy. All right, so as we get going. Oh, so good. We'll do the regular as usual, right? I'm going to read along. I say highlight this. You highlight it. Answers will be the highlight section for the following day when you're in class again. All right? So, here we are. French Revolution. All right. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to have to die in order for not much to happen. It really ends up being like an ideology thing that we'll get into when I get back into class. But this kind of like gives you a basic overview of how everything kind of went into play. Because a lot of people think that the French Revolution is directly related to the previous American Revolution, and nothing could be further from the truth. Because as we talked about in Bush, the Revolution in America was fought not to change, not to create a revolution, right? It was not a revolution of society. It was fought to maintain a way of life that already existed. Whereas the French Revolution really ushered in new ways of thinking. Nothing tangible, nothing gonna be, it's just gonna lead to Napoleon and a bunch of dictatorship after already everybody dies because they're from paranoia and classic dictatorship type things when humanity gets power. But some of the concepts are going to be very, very important down the road, right? And so, with that being said, the French Revolution. As France entered the second half of the 18th century, in many ways it stood as one of the most influential nations in Europe. The seemingly stable economy was supported by a culture that dominated Western Europe and a language that was spoken in most courts during diplomatic exchanges. The cultural development of France made it a focal point for Enlightenment thought. However, this intellectual triumph created a number of philosophies that clashed with an antiquated political and three-tiered class structure steeped in medieval concepts and ideals. Highlight this. Like many governments in Europe, the French monarchy suffered from an inability to provide information about its policies to the bottom third of their population. Stop there. As a result, even in times of justifiable and effective legislation, the Third Estate only saw the corruption of the Bourbon regime. Keep in mind that the Bourbons are the royal family of France at the time, right? Like the Windsors are the royal family of England. You have the Bourbons, or the Bourbon, if you for Dawson, you know, because I know you're big into French. So the Bourbon, if you don't know how to say it, just ask Dawson. And so, the Bourbon regime. For years, this class resentment gained momentum until small steps towards reform erupted into revolution. Highlight this. With 3 distinct phases, the French Revolution witnessed a moderate beginning, which quickly deteriorated into a radical reign of terror, and ended with a reactionary framework of government that left a power vacuum, which would be filled by Napoleon Bonaparte. Stop there. And so that's the key thing I want to make sure everyone understands is you have this idea of like maybe we go parliamentary monarchy. Maybe that's how that's going to end up, right? Maybe it's going to be like Great Britain. And then that all completely dissolves and you go into this reign of terror where if you think of the guillotine and all that type of stuff that's going on in that really horrific time, Tale of Two Cities, right? That type of stuff. You know, that's that middle phase. And then it all ends in Napoleon, right? Which is going to be even worse, right? It's one of those things. All right. As the 3 stages of the French Revolution unfolded, the impact of events would not be contained. The French Revolution created a ripple effect that would overthrow and reshape the social and political structures of Europe. The old regime of France operated under a class system, which was comprised of 3 estates. The first was highlight this. The first was composed of the clergy and the Catholic Church, which was exempt from the taxes. The second was made up of the nobles, and for all intents and purposes were also exempt from taxation. The third estate included the middle class, urban partisans, and peasants. Stop there. This third estate was the largest portion of France's population by a wide margin, and while France had a commercial middle class, the bulk of the bourgeoisie was made up of peasants who lived and worked on the land. During the rule of Louis XIV, a combination of corruption and inefficient administration of government and foreign wars had forced the monarchy to create a series of taxes that include such things as the taille, a land tax, income taxes, poll taxes, and a tithe to the Catholic Church. As the nobility could not be taxed in the same manner, the burden fell upon the bourgeoisie. As the coronation of Louis XVI took place in 1774, the king expressed a desire not to be viewed as the despot that his father had, and encouraged by his minister, Turgot, did look to implement concepts of the Enlightenment into his court. Highlight this. As France began to support the American Revolution, however, Louis XVI was forced to find new sources of income and sought to tax the formerly exempt church and nobility. The reaction would set in motion a series of events that would lead to the foundation of the French Revolution. Stop there. And so that's kind of key. Right? Church was never really taxed. Nobility was never really taxed, which made it all the money fell on the peasants. When Louis XVI, after essentially going bankrupt, helping the United States become the United States, starts to implement a tax on the nobility, right? The nobility, they look to seek an alliance with the third estate, the peasantry, to combined control the authority of the king, right? And that's why we mean by it starts out moderately, right? As Louis XVI moved to implement new taxes upon the nobility, the aristocracy questioned the ability of the monarch to levy new taxes. The issue went to the High Court of France, the Parliament of Paris, which ruled that no such taxes could be created without the consent of the State General, despite the fact that the legislative body had not convened since 1614. Think of the States General as like Britain's Parliament, right, for their parliamentary monarchy, right? Because remember, France has been absolutist, right? All right. Like this. This ruling encouraged the Second Estate, the nobles, to unify with the Third Estate, the peasantry, against the authority of Louis XVI. And as representatives of the Estates General met at Versailles, right, the big palace place that Louis XIV created to kind of take, central focus off of Paris, right, and control his nobility, right. Debate concerning the identity, still highlighting, of and membership of the Third Estate encouraged the bourgeoisie to declare themselves the National Assembly and therefore the only true representatives of the French people. Stop there. This new title and political maneuver encouraged them to declare not only their power to tax, but also encourage the population of France to withhold taxation if the government proved to be inflexible. Like this. In reaction to the power grab being perpetrated by the National Assembly, Louis XVI called upon the military to lock the representatives of the Estates General out of Versailles. Correspondingly, you're highlighting, I believe, right, from in reaction to power, as we keep going. Correspondingly, in June 1789, the Estates General representatives met at the palace tennis courts, where they declared an oath that the National Assembly would stay in existence and refrain from dissolution until the continuation had been written. Keep highlighting, this is a long one. King Louis XVI in action to this tennis court oath, which combined with the food shortages which had occurred as a result of the attempts to deregulate the grain market, led to food riots in the cities and the peasant rebellions in rural areas that culminated with the storming of the Bastille, a symbol of royal justice, 1 month later. Stop there. So when the nobility and the peasants try to meet as the Estates General, Louis XVI shuts them out. They move to the tennis courts, where they then declare that they are going to create this new system of government, regardless of whether Louis XVI likes it or not, right? You take all this political, intensity, throw in food shortages for the peasantry, and you have yourself all the things you would ever need for rebellion, right? Okay. Unable to ask the king for the use of the military to put down the peasants' revolt taking place in both the rural and urban areas of France for fear that it would then be used by the National Assembly on the National Assembly itself, the representatives instead joined a revolution already in motion and declared an end to feudalism. Highlight this. In place of this system, the National Assembly set forth the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Stop there. Espousing such concepts of freedom of speech, religion, due process of law, and taxation, authorized by the consent of the governed, the documents introduced an important interpretation of the citizen possessing power as well as rights. The National Assembly set forth to establish a constitution, however, their inability to control the mob led the revolution toward a violent path. And so, really, you have the National Assembly going on, and then you also have the peasantry, right? Because the National Assembly includes the nobility and the peasantry, but the leadership of the peasantry is in the National Assembly. The peasantry themselves, almost from a ground up moment, start a rebellion because they're hungry because of all the food shortages, right? And so then the National Assembly, because they can't use the military to stop them, because then Louis XVI could turn it on them, right? They decide to join that revolution, but that revolution is so out of hand they can't control it, and the violence is going to ensue, right? As always happens in Europe. All right. Highlight this. From August 1789 to 1790, the Great Fear swept through France as the Third Estate rose up against the nobility and destroyed any records of the old feudal system. And there's, stop there. And that's where it really goes bad, because then the Third Estate turns on the nobility. And when the nobility and the Third Estate, right, the peasantry had been trying to work together, but when this rebellion starts and then the violence gets out of hand, the Third Estate realizes they hold all the population numbers, and they turn on the nobility, and now it's going to get really bad. All right? That Great Fear. All right? All right. As the fear swept through the countryside, a Paris mob comprised mainly of women who had been influenced by Jean-Paul Marat marched on Versailles. Their goal was to force the king to relocate Tuileries, the royal residence of Paris. As the National Assembly also arrived in Paris, they too were intimidated by the mob, yet continued to work on the drafting of a new constitution. Key developments by the National Assembly, which at this point had remained the Constituent Assembly, included the seizure of church and monastery lands to build revenue and abolishment of convents and monasteries. Convents being for nuns, monasteries being for monks. All right, highlight this. More importantly, was the creation of a new legislative assembly, which established the king as the chief executive officer responsible to the assembly, and created voting qualifications for male citizens. Stop there. So from the more importantly to male citizens, you should have that highlighted. Fearful of the direction the revolution was taking, Louis XVI tried to flee from Paris to Varennes in order to try and raise an army to stop the revolutionaries, but was once again stopped by the Parisian mob. Highlight this. This attempt by the monarch to overthrow the revolution, when combined with the outside threat of the Declaration of Pillnitz by the King of Austria, only served to reinvigorate the radical revolutionaries of France, who sought to abolish all traces of monarchy. Stop there. The French Revolution was about to enter its second bloody stage. Dramatic pause. After receiving Austria's declaration against the revolution, in the spring of 1792, the Legislative Assembly used the opportunity to inflame the mobs of Paris when France and support what would become known as the Wars of the Revolution. Highlight this. By the summer of 1792, with Prussian forces set to invade France, the Brunswick Manifesto was released, threatening the people of Paris if any harm came to Louis XVI. The radical Republican Jacobins, who had come to power after the Declaration of Pillnitz and led by Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, remember that guy's name. Robespierre is the classic example of the slogan or the mantra, if you've ever heard of it. You either die the hero or you live to become the villain. Like, it's one of those types of deals. All right. Especially in revolution. All right. Led by Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, used this threat to control and arouse the Paris mob, who stormed the Tuileries and took the king prisoner while killing a number of priests, bourgeois, and aristocrats in the process. Stop there. Facing little resistance, the Legislative Assembly, now known as the National Convention, declared France a republic. Highlight this. Despite such a declaration, a clear division within the Assembly was taking shape, with the radical liberal Jacobins, supported by the sans-culotte working class Paris mobs on one side, and the conservative Girondists, supported by the peasants in the rural areas and the bourgeois on the other. Stop there. So you got two parts, right? The Jacobins, who control the sans-culottes, and if you're wondering, that's where culotte pants come from. Just throwing that out there. They wore short pants. It was okay back then. No concern. All right. But they're the poorest of the poor, the sans-culottes. And they're controlled, and keep in mind, they're the poorest of the poor in urban city areas. And the Jacobites, the Jacobins, they control, all right, the urban areas. The Girondists also have peasants, but they're in rural areas. And you're going to quickly find out in revolution, it doesn't matter if you control the rural countryside. You've got to control the cities. That's how you control things. And so the Girondists are going to end up being usurped by the Jacobins. All right? With concerns over power and exercise of it, both sides made attempts to gain control of the National Convention. Using his ability to rally the mob around attacks on the old monarchy, highlight this, Robespierre was able to put Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, who history has treated extremely unfairly. She never said that let them eat cake line, ever. All right? We'll get to that when I get back, okay? on trial for treason and sends them to the guillotine in January of 1793. Having gained the upper hand through igniting the bloodlust of the Parisian mob against the old regime, the Jacobins used this opportunity to incite the radical working class of leaders of Paris, known as the Enrages, against the Girondist members of the National Convention and arrest them. Stop there. Well, with the Jacobins in complete control of the convention, Danton and Robespierre became concerned about the holding on their newly gained power in a position and implemented a plan for taking out any enemies to that power through what came to be known as in the summer of 1793 as the Committee of Public Safety. If the Committee of Public Safety sounds like it's some weird utopian like horror show, that's because it is. Never in the history of anything has a government named something the Committee of Public Safety and it turned out okay. All right. Highlight this. With Danton serving as the first president of this organization, the revolution entered what came to be known as the Reign of Terror. From the summer of 1793 to 1794, thousands of people were killed, with a large percentage of them coming from the working class and the peasantry. Stop there. Don't confuse the Reign of Terror with the Great Fear. The Great Fear is in the first stage of the revolution, when the third estate, the peasantry, turns on the nobility. The Reign of Terror is when the second phase occurs and they have declared themselves a republic, gotten rid of the king, and now all the internal third estates, all right, that are battling it out with the Jacobins and the Girondists and the sans-culottes and the Enrages, right? The sans-culottes are the poorest of the poor, and the subsection of sans-culottes, the poorest of the sans-culottes, are the Enrages. And everybody wants power, and everybody thinks they're the real answer to the revolution and this new government they're making. And as a result, they start eating their own, right? Paranoia sets in. Who's your enemies? You're trying to take power and you're trying to maintain power. And then this is where the guillotines come in and everybody starts eliminating who they think's a threat. That's the Reign of Terror. Okay? So Great Fear, Third Estate, peasantry turning on the nobility. Reign of Terror, the Third Estate eating itself. Right? Okay. Here we go. Sorry. All right. With only the church and the clergy left to provide any real challenge to Jacobin power in the National Convention, highlight this, the Republic of Virtue is released by the Committee of Public Safety as an attempt to de-Christianize France and take away what power the church had left. What the Jacobins hoped to gain from this, however, quickly turned on them, and that is the Catholic majority of France balked at the concept. Stop there. Biggest mistake they ever made. You can't get rid of the Christian at this point. You cannot get rid of the Catholic Church. You can't all of a sudden say Catholic religion doesn't matter. Right? Because the peasantry who have grown up on that, who have lived and breathed that and truly believed in that are going to turn on you. Right? So that's the mistake that the Jacobins made. That's the mistake that the Committee of Public Safety is going to make. Okay. When combined with the deaths that took place during the Reign of Terror, you should have stopped, by the way, highlighting it, balked at the concept. When combined with the deaths that took place during the Reign of Terror, the once controllable Paris mobs began to turn on the Jacobin-controlled convention, thus forcing the Jacobin leaders to in turn go against each other. By 1794, Marat, Robespierre, and Danton were dead, with these last two put to death as enemies of the revolution. That's that whole die the bad guy? Yeah. With the radical revolutionaries no longer in power, moderate bourgeois farmers were able to come to power. The third and final phase of the revolution took place between 1795 and 1799 as the, highlight this, 5-member executive known as the Directory. This sounds like it's from The Giver. That's what this sounds like, right? At no point do you go from Committee of Public Safety to the Directory and have that be okay. It's just, no. All right? So, keeping highlighting. As the 5-member executive known as the Directory was established to run the government of France. When the Directory was threatened by the Paris mob, French General Napoleon Bonaparte, who was in Paris at the time of the riot, put down the threat and in return was given command of the French armies against armies fighting the Austrians in Italy. Stop there. Napoleon, of course, that's the Napoleon, right? Who was not actually short. He was of average height. He has made himself famous fighting the British down in Egypt. And he actually had found the Rosetta Stone, which, if you remember, the Rosetta Stone is how we are able to discover what all the translation of hieroglyphs, right? If you remember, the Rosetta Stone is a big giant rock. Half of it, hence the stone part, half of it is written in ancient Greek, which we did understand. And then the bottom half is Egyptian hieroglyph. And after decades of looking at it, people realized that the Greek and the hieroglyph Egyptian part were translations of each other. And so that's how we were able to eventually figure out what hieroglyphs are. So thanks, Napoleon, for, I guess, that, right? So he becomes super popular after his excursions down in Egypt, and he comes back, and they put him in charge of the army. Now that's going to be a mistake, because then he's going to ransack all of France's enemies, of course, and then he's going to turn that power and popularity onto the Directory, shocker, and take control himself, right? So anyway, having gained support of the masses both inside and outside of Paris, with important victories over Austrian forces as well as British forces in Egypt, Napoleon seized control of France through a military coup. Highlight this. Disbanding the Directorate, Napoleon moved to establish the new consulate, consisting of 3 consuls, with Napoleon serving as the head consul and emperor in 1804. Stop there. The revolution had come to an end. However, its consequences would reverberate for centuries to come. By 1802, 1 million French citizens had been killed during one of the 3 phases of the French Revolution. Well, I'd like to note that, okay, because this is the 1800s, everybody, right? Like, it's just the dawn of the 1800s. Most of this is in the 18th century. It's just starting the 19th century. And that's by 1802. 1 million French citizens have been killed from phase 1 to phase 3. We aren't even in the Napoleonic Wars yet. I just want to throw that. We're not even in the Napoleonic Wars yet. And you have 1 million French people dead, right? Like, this is the insanity of this whole era of European history, as they, as the Enlightenment begins to not only challenge the church, right, in terms of science and reason to understand things, but also begins to challenge, through guys like Locke, the monarchy, right? I mean, it's crazy. That mind-boggling, okay? Mind-boggling. All right. Sorry. So 1 million French citizens have been killed. What remains is a question of what was gained with such sacrifice. For the peasantry, in terms of economic gain, very little acquired. While some groups, such as the bourgeoisie, gained as a result of the French Revolution, the wars of the Revolution had destroyed international trade. Furthermore, it forced the National Assembly to enact militia programs that drafted thousands of the peasantry and the sans-culottes into service for these wars, when in reality, they were looking to have less government involvement in their lives. Despite this, as William Doyle points out, if the purpose of the French Revolution were to be summed up in one word, it would be liberty. I would also argue, especially when you're talking about the bourgeoisie and the sans-culottes, the working class, right? So keep in mind that these terms, right, the sans-culottes and the peasantry are eventually going to become known by a term as the proletariat, because we are also getting closer and closer and closer to the development of Marxism, all right? And 2 words you need to understand in understanding Marxism is the bourgeoisie, right, which now, at that point in the French Revolution, they weren't, I mean, they included some of the upper elites. They would have included some of your doctors, lawyers, your big industry owners, things like that. But it wasn't the bulk of it, okay? But they will become that. That's what the bourgeoisie will become. Your upper middle class to wealthy elites, right? And then your sans-culottes, poor, are going to become the proletariat, the working class, right? Okay. And that Marxism stuff is that constant struggle between the working class and the elites, right? Because ultimately the bourgeoisie, after all this is said and done, right, even when monarchy finally goes away, arguably, right, through capitalism, control things. And as a result, the working class, the proletariat, get all the crap, right? It's one of those types of things. So keep that in mind. All right. But liberty is an important concept here that does come out of the French Revolution, as we'll get to here. So anyway, highlight this. The French Revolution established that people of a nation were sovereign. Throughout Europe, the French Revolution impacted the development of nations, as both Italy and Germany were unified under one French-dominated government. Stop there. All right, and so the importance of this is, okay, the idea that the individual is sovereign. Here's why that's such a big deal, okay? The idea of individual as independently sovereign, okay, means that the laws of a nation cannot be made in a way that they affect people in a social groups differently than people in other social groups. And I mean that by social strata. So like whether they are the upper elites, the wealthiest of the wealthy, or the middle class, or the poor, or the poorest of the poor. regardless of where you fall in that strata, the idea of the individual sovereign means all of you, in the eyes of the government, are to be treated equally. And so what that means, why that's a big deal, is that would then usurp, okay, ideas in, let's say, the American Constitution, which at this point still allows slavery, right? And the idea that the American government is going through things, and we look at the treatment of Native Americans, you look at the treatment of ethnic minorities, and I don't just mean blacks, I mean like Irish immigrants that'll be coming in. All of them end up getting kind of treated differently and less than compared to like nativist Americans, right? Native born, I don't mean Native Americans, but native born white Protestant people, right? And so the French Revolution ushers in this idea, all right, that everyone is equal and no laws can be made to not treat them equally. And this is where you're going to get a lot of eventual resistance to slavery and all those ideas, taking down the Atlantic trades, the transatlantic slave trade and all that different type of stuff, and like equal rights for everyone. That's where that comes from, and that's why it's such a big deal. Like that ultimately, if you haven't caught on yet, is why the French Revolution is important, because it gives us that idea. Now, 1 million French citizens had to die, right, in just the revolution, and then millions more are going to die throughout Europe during the Napoleonic Wars to get us that. But I mean, that ultimately is an important thing that dramatically changes European society, and eventually the United States as well, all the way up to now. When if you look at like Title IX, right, with equality in women's sports in schools and all that type of stuff, there's a direct line from Title IX all the way back to the idea of the French Revolution that the individual is sovereign. That's my point there, if that makes sense. I'll stop now. All right, because we're almost done. All right. So, other big important thing, Italy is unified under Napoleon. Germany is unified under Napoleon. Okay. Now, yes, when Napoleon eventually loses, Italy will dissolve and Germany will dissolve, but they've had that unity for a little bit, right? Each one of them. And by the end of the 19th century, guess what? Both will unify, right? And the idea is that Napoleon's occupation of those two regions led to the idea that those countries could come together as nations like they hadn't been yet, right? So it's ironic, right? If you look at the 30 Years' War, okay, and France's whole goal in the French phase of the 30 Years' War was to prevent German states in the Holy Roman Empire, right, from uniting as Germany. And then in comes Napoleon. Technically he's Corsican, but I mean like, and then taking over the French Empire, right? And the French therefore make Germany kind of now possible as a unified entity. I just find that ironic and classic European history, right? But that's kind of like the key thing there. And if you're wondering, once we get to the Napoleon stuff, that will be the end of the Holy Roman Empire as well. It'll cease to exist, thank God, because like that's been a super pain, right? I think we can all agree. So anyway, now I'll continue. Got you on that last one. All right. In Latin America, colonies such as Haiti were inspired by the revolutionary concepts that encouraged them to break from France and encourage other colonies in the region to break away from a weakening Spanish Empire. As the world entered the 19th century, the French Revolution would serve as the first modern revolution. All right. So with that said, we are done. I believe that you will be doing this on Wednesday. So on Thursday, you guys will get the questions for this. You guys can just work on that, and that way you won't have any homework because it's the long weekend. And so I am right now currently probably in the woods having a spectacular time. So I hope you guys can at least kind of have an okay time in school, in that regard. But hey, I will see you all on Monday. I'm looking forward to it. Kind of, because I am probably having a great time, but I mean, yes, I miss you. I'm sure that I do. I miss you right now, so why wouldn't I then, right? But anyway, I will see you on Monday. I love you guys, and enjoy the long weekend.